Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it's Tuesday, December 14th, 2010. And our special guest on the future of education tonight is Deborah Meier. And I don't think we have Deborah on the phone yet. We're hoping that she will show up. Deborah, are you there? I didn't think so. Future of Education is sponsored by my employer, Illuminate, now Blackboard Collaborate. The project I work on is learncentral.org. It's a social network for educators that has Illuminate baked in. It is free, and you get the free 3% Illuminate room when you join Learn Central. We hope you'll come and take advantage of that. Tomorrow are the EduBlog Awards. Future of Education was nominated for an EduBlog Award, as were many other very worthy individuals and websites. Go to edublogawards.com. The voting ends tonight. In fact, it ends in 4 hours, just under 4 hours. So if you have a favorite, someone you want to vote for, I understand that in several categories the differences are down to 1 or 2 votes. So I'm going to be voting in a few minutes. I am co-hosting tomorrow night, so it should be a lot of fun. So that's tomorrow, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Go to edublogawards.com for the links. Coming up Thursday, tomorrow is the EduBlog Awards. Coming up Thursday is Alfie Kohn, as well a late December or mid-December night, so that may be why we have fewer participants than usual, but great guests, and that may be why those guests are available. Then we take a little bit of a break until January. Ira David Sokol comes on, Will Richardson, Barnett Berry, Karen Cater will now be on the 24th of January, and that's confirmed. Karen Hume on February 3rd, David Perkins on the 15th, March 1st, Andy Hirsch on libraries and digital literacy. Lots more fun coming up. If you have missed the show, they're all recorded. futureofeducation.com, Julie Young on Florida Virtual School. That was Thursday of last week. I had a terrible cold. You'll hear that in my voice, but a great interview, and what a really terrific lady. Karen Egan, Phil Schlechte, Matt Levins, Steve Farr, Vicky Abeles, lots of other great guests. Hope that one of those recordings, or several, catch your eye and are worth listening to at some point. If this is your first time at Illuminate, it is a participative environment. This is a small group, so you may not need to do this, but I always go up to view layouts, and I switch to the wide layout. And given the size of the group and not hearing Deborah on the line yet, I'm not going to go through the full orientation, but if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll help you through it. So, for fun, those of you who are here, you can let us know where you're participating from. Look for the wand with the red star at the end. Click on that, click on the map. You can also shout it out in the chat. Bill, thanks for reminding us that you're in Manila. I always feel shy about geographies in Southeast Asia. So, again, as always, wherever you're participating from, we're sure glad to have you, and we appreciate your taking the time. Now, let's give Deborah a chance here again. Deborah, are you on the line by chance? I think it's possible that she is going to miss tonight. I did have email contact with her just a few days ago, and she remembered the date, and she had it on her calendar, so I'm sure there's some reason that she's not here. But I think that what I will do is I'm going to wait 5 minutes. I'm going to pause the recording, and we'll see if she comes on. If she does not, we'll close. If she does come on, we will record, so if you get tired of waiting, you're certainly welcome to go. But I'm going to click that pause button, and we will give her a few minutes here. Recording started. So, now I noticed that you go by Deb, and I've heard you called Deb. Do you like Deb or Deborah?
Oh, Deborah. I like Deborah. But I just, it takes 4 more. type, it's a little longer. I use everything.
But Deborah's your preferred?
It's my preferred.
Well, that's easy for us. Hey, I need to tell you just how much... Go ahead, I'm sorry. You're going to find with the telephone bridge that there's a little bit of a lag, and so I'll try not to speak over you, but if I do, I'll just stop and then I'll let you finish.
Okay.
Are you there?
Yeah. These pauses, you're doing something? Are you doing something? Hello?
So we had some kind of a system lag and your audio's catching up, so it will just be a second.
Oh, okay. I wasn't clear whether these silences, were you doing something else or are being disconnected?
So there's been some long delay in the audio. I have not seen that. I haven't seen that in a while.
Who am I
but
talking
it's
to right
definitely delayed
now?
for everybody. I can see for all of you, you're getting a delay. So hopefully we'll be caught up in just a second here.
No, I just wondered.
If you're getting the
who I'm talking
what we
to
call
right
chipmunking, which is where the audio speeds up to make sure that nothing gets lost.
Okay, Steve.
So this is Steve Hargadon. So again, I'm waiting. I have an indicator here that tells me that the audio is getting back to normal, and I'm just waiting for that to happen. And it looks like everybody but Eleanor has full audio, so we'll go ahead and move forward. So, Deborah, I wanted to tell you just sort of what a pleasure it was to read much of your material today. It's kind of magical the degree to which we've wended our way through the last couple of years of discussions to arrive at your books, which so fully describe some of the themes that have been a part of the interview series. In particular, building cultures of education and ideas around local engagement.
I'm a native, actually, New Yorker, but I went to college.
Are you willing to give us sort of a short synopsis of your
University
history
of
for those
Chicago
who might not know much about
and had
you?
some children. And while my children were young, I wanted to make a little money, so I started substituting in schools. But I had absolutely no interest in education. But somehow I landed teaching in a half-day kindergarten across the street from where I lived and where my children went to school, and fell in love with being a kindergarten teacher. And we made several moves after that. I taught Head Start and I taught kindergarten then in Central Harlem. And somewhere along the line, got interested in trying to build collegial communities among teachers. And that led to a proposal from the superintendent in East Harlem for me to start a school, a public school in East Harlem, that would be a choice school for parents in East Harlem. And that was 1974, and we opened that fall, and it was so popular that we opened 2 more satellite schools, separate schools, but we, in the beginning, we pooled all our resources and awaiting in the admissions. So parents wouldn't choose between the 3. And the school, 2 of those 3 first schools are still thriving in East Harlem. And then in 1985, I started a secondary school at the urging of parents at our school, so that kids could keep that kind of education going through high school. And we started a secondary school, and it was very successful and much heralded. And then we started a bunch of high schools in New York and collaborated with other people who were coming to the same ideas that we were and ready to do something different. And there was, about 50 to 100 such schools around the city, elementary, middle schools, and high schools. And we built a network then, and we had all kinds of ideas of how this network might approach the question of accountability differently, and how they might develop a different form of assessment that more accurately reflected schools' impact on children's futures. And we got a big grant to do that, and we started it, and we did some really transformative work. But we got a new chancellor came in, and he wasn't willing to expand this program. And for various reasons, I then chose to go to Boston, where I could go back. During this period, last period, I was sort of out of the classroom and out of the school and being sort of political, and I was really tired of that. So I was invited to start a pilot school in the Boston public school system, which was kind of like a charter-like thing, but we were part of the regular Boston public schools, and I remember teachers were all members of the union, etc. And that was very exciting. It was a K through 8 school, so it was a little of my elementary experience and my secondary school experience. And I did that for 10 years and then retired. And now I just keep writing. When I left New York is when I wrote the first book. I wrote lots of articles before that, but I wrote The Power of Their Ideas when I left New York City and had the time to really reflect on that experience. And then since then I wrote a book about my experience in Boston and a few other books.
So I felt like I got to know you very well in one story in the book, and that's when you drive up to Boston and over a kitchen table say, we should start a school.
Mm-hmm. That is a wonderful story, and my friend Brenda is the co-author of the last book I wrote. She's the one whose kitchen table we tried at, and she and I collaborated on another book about early childhood and about recess and play, called Playing for Keeps, which just came out a few months ago.
So, as I recall, you had some experiences as a teacher, though, that did kind of shape your perceptions about sort of power and authority related to that job that seemed to now be a pretty significant thread in your books.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I had actually gone to fairly progressive schools in the private sector, and I don't think I ever really knew. I just assumed public schools were similar, but classes were larger, and the students were more heterogeneous than they were in a private school. I didn't realize how different, until I began to sub in Chicago, how extraordinarily different was the culture of the school itself, and the interactions between teachers and students, and the attitude towards families, and what they thought was what they were required to teach. And so in some degrees, it was the things that I just took for granted were the way you would educate children weren't there. And I could see, as I got to know the system better, how hard it would be for teachers who didn't have my background, who had themselves been the product of such schools, and who, working under the worst possible conditions, would not want to rethink education, how hard it would be to change the norms of schooling. But it seemed to me absolutely essential. In a way, politically, I was sort of political. And so I thought, aside from the fact that I happen to love this, it's its own form of political contribution, because this was not a setting that was inclined to produce adults who could be the citizens we need. And the school was not interested in really the young people's ideas, how they arrived at ideas, what was really on their mind. It didn't teach them to re-examine their own assumptions, as well as open up possibilities of listening to each other's assumptions. I mean, all of that was eliminated, and that is so essential to democratic life. I'm just reading an article, going through files of Meier, of someone doing a study of children's attitudes towards the basic rights. Someone was following a class where they were teaching about American, rights, the right to this, the right to that, the Bill of Rights. And then they asked the students whether they thought those rights made sense, and the students would say yes, and then they would say, well, give me an example. And the students all gave examples of where it wouldn't be right. That is, if you disagree, if it was really important, then you shouldn't worry about warrants for arrest, and then you shouldn't worry about, in general, they were perfectly prepared to overthrow every one of the rights if it was important. And I thought that's sort of probably how most Americans feel about democracy. That it's a wonderful thing unless something is very important, and then you just can't afford democracy. And I thought that's a very important question, and we don't explore it in school. And we don't explore it either in the classroom or in the way we organize each other in the school. Kids have no idea how teachers arrive at decisions. They have no idea how a faculty explores ideas together. They don't know what we think about their families and hear their families and us talk about ideas and then figure out what we're going to do when we disagree. And they're not part of that. And that's how we learn most things when we're young, is from the grown-ups that we keep company with. So that was the main impact, was to realize that if you, for 12 years, you keep company with a bunch of grown-ups who represent adulthood, and you never see them engaged in any of the things we claim are important and essential, they may learn to parrot the words, but when it comes down to how you function, they fall back on other theories.
Well, I think the story that was so vivid for me was the principal criticizing the students for not being on the center white line, and in doing so kind of berating or belittling the teacher at the same time. And I'm reminded of the kind of parallel universes in which teachers and students live, where obedience is the primary norm rather than questioning or engagement or curiosity.
So why should they think that that's not part of the civic norm? When kids in the old-fashioned America, where we didn't spend much time in school, really, we forget that up until recently, schooling was a side event for most young people. And during those days, young people saw a lot more about how adults actually functioned in the world. Probably knew that they were often non-compliant. That they were part of an adult world, which was often very cruel for them. But they had a wider range of ideas about what adulthood meant. And outside of their own immediate family, children grow up today without that. They have their peer packs, and they have their family, and they have the school. But they're not members of a larger adult community. There isn't any such adult community they could join.
One of the interesting points you make in the book, in your books, I think in several places, is that there are many, many good schools, but somehow we don't see them, or they don't become a part of the larger dialogue. Why do you think that is? Well, because they need to be encouraged over a long enough period of time so they too can survive. If all the schools like this had survived, that were started like this but eventually crushed, there'd be a lot more. In other words, when I left New York City, there was at least 100. There had been none when I came to New York City. I'm not claiming I was the difference, but it just that period of time. And there literally were no schools like these. By the time I left, which was, 15 years later, there was at least 100. And many more exploring. And there were, during the coalition, there were hundreds of high schools. They're having a very hard time surviving these schools because all the policies for reform
want to make them more, that are going in the opposite direction. They demean teachers even more. They are based on compliance and the one right answer, on everybody being on the same page. So that the good schools, like I'm describing, and this is a cycle in American education, so the good schools I'm describing have to hide. At best, they hide. They're unlucky, and somebody else is sent into them to reform them.
So I
without any official help.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, please. I'm sorry if I cut you off. So in schools we trust seem to me to be this just wonderful framework for understanding a different way of looking at schools. And the first part of that was trusting parents. I interviewed the director of a movie called Race to Nowhere. Her name is Vicky Abellis. And in the interview I commented to her that I was really appreciative of the thread throughout the movie of the power and importance of families. And as I recall, she replied in the interview and said, "You're the first person in all the interviews I've done who's mentioned that. So why don't we trust parents?"
There are conflicting reasons. So what I'm going to say sounds inconsistent. There are some communities in America, but those aren't the ones we're worrying about, where school people don't trust parents because because parents have more power than they do. So teachers are afraid of parents. Principals are afraid of parents, and you probably recognize what I'm describing. But for the schools we want to reform, the general assumption is that these children have no parents, or if they have parents, that they're a bad influence on them. So it hardly encourages us to listen to the parents, because we've already decided that they're the cause of the children's problems, and we are the saviors. End of that sentence.
Well, you tell the story of your father's operation, and I think many of us have had that experience where we were in a medical circumstance with a loved one, and we recognize just how important it is for us to be active participants. And I love the kind of connection you made there with education.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's part of our life, the fear of being put down, and the fear which leads us to want to get that makes us act in ways that we can't make it harder for someone to put us down. But I think that's part of growing up in our culture, and it shouldn't be. That we're looking for somebody else to make a mistake so that they can't blame us.
So then you talk about trusting teachers, and we had a really good interview on the show, teachers as partners, and we've talked about this before. But how do you create a culture where you trust teachers and the teachers are involved in the decision-making in a school?
Well, first of all, by the way, and I think it starts off with a leap of faith. It really does. And it's that leap of faith that I think the idea of democracy itself has to make, even though it will often be betrayed. But if you're not willing to act as if most people are trustworthy, and if most people have good intentions, and as if most people are not, are not out to destroy everybody else. If you can make that assumption, it just changes what you see and hear. Then when a child says something, which you might think is he's just wasting your time, or he's just pretending, or he's just acting dumb, you just hear him differently. Now you realize, not suddenly, you get accustomed to realizing when a child says something that may sound stupid, that it's because you didn't understand something that's going through his mind. And you have to say the same thing about your fellow colleagues. Your assumption has to be that they're not here teaching because this is an easy way of life, because they want to make fast buck, or because they hate children. That's so unlikely a reason why they're here, that the odds are that when they do things that annoy you, they're working on very different assumptions, and you have to hear each other out. But once you start off as if all of us are well-intentioned, you're able to listen differently and hear differently and respond differently. And when you do that, it's transformative. It really is. I don't know how to explain to people, because until you do that, and consistently, because people haven't lived in such communities very often, but you have to do it consistently, even when you think you've been betrayed. You have to keep going as though you hadn't been. So when I started school in New York, I remember feeling so baffled by some teacher who was hoarding stuff in her closet, even though we had it open. You could go into the supply closet anytime you wanted. The principal, I didn't. They weren't given out to you, but you follow what I mean. So why was she hoarding all this stuff? Until I realized that she's been teaching for 15 years and has discovered the value of hoarding. And she may have as a child too. Who knows? It might just announcing that the storeroom is open and we all agree to do that. It doesn't change a habit any more than they do. Habits are changed that easily by kids. They've found reasons to distrust adults. The fact that you say you're trustworthy will take a little while for them to believe. So, but it, we had when we started Mission Hill, I think I mentioned in the book, at the end of the summer, I overhear a conversation in which somebody asks Geraldine, well, how's it to work for Deborah Meier? And Geraldine answered, oh, I don't work for her. We work together. And that shift in language, you can't teach people that shift in language. They have to just feel it. She felt really insulted for the first time in her life in the idea that she was working for the principal, and that rather than that we were all working for the kids.
What occurred to me over and over in the stories you tell in the books is dedicated, passionate, authentic individuals who want to make a difference for students, spending lots and lots of time building and creating these cultures and recognizing that it's not just as easy as following some ABC system.
Mm-hmm. Teachers all know that, but sometimes they follow a system because at least they can't be blamed then. I did what you told me. And that is the most destructive mindset that any adult should grow up having. That to avoid being blamed, I did what I was told. And I think we're deeply immersed now in that kind of culture. When you're first a novice, sometimes it's wise to do that. Not because it's not a put down. To do what you're told by an expert when you acknowledge you're a novice is a sensible first step. Then you can begin to evaluate it. Like we've often picked up a program in our schools and said, let's try this for a month, doing just what they tell us. We read it over and it sounded kind of interesting. But at the end of a month, let's get together and see what we want to do with this. Because sometimes there is a place for just following a prescription. Although, unfortunately, going back to medicine, I just did that recently, and I had a conference with my doctor yesterday, and there was a complete misunderstanding. And I've been taking a medication I shouldn't have been taking for about a month because I was sort of compliant. There's something seemed wrong. There seemed to be a contradiction in what she had said, but it was clear she had said to take this pill. And I'm used to complying with doctors. But there are risks if we don't ask questions. Well, you said this and then you said that. And of course, some people will get annoyed when you say that. Are you trying to contradict me? Or you think you know more than I do? You just started teaching. How do you know? So it makes sense in the first year or so to be a little bit compliant until you've got a hold of this thing. And then begin to shift the second year and the third year. But by that time, 30-40% of American teachers are no longer in the same classroom they started in. So we just do not give professionalism an opportunity to grow on teachers' part, and certainly not the time it takes to treat your colleagues and your families with respect. I mean, it is disrespectful when we ask parents to come to school for family nights and we program them for 5 minutes. Clearly, or 10 minutes at maximum. Both sides know this is a phony meeting, but we don't have time for the length of time it takes to build relationships with our colleagues or with our parents.
I have some good friends who are starting a chartered school here in California, and reading your book, I thought, this is the book I would want them to be able to read, especially in schools we trust. This is the book I'd want them to be able to read and talk to each other about it. Did you ever use that as a tool for kind of building your school community, having common readings?
Yes, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to do. And yes, we did. And we did two things, common readings. We did it when we started the school. One of the books we read to start the secondary school was a book by Mike Rose called Lives Across the Boundary. It's a marvelous book about class and schooling and so forth. And it's just wonderful. He's a very sensitive writer and storyteller. And the other thing we did would be to read something and then agree that we're going to observe that in our classes and come back to it. Like there is a book by an article by Claude Steele in California on what keeps certain kids, especially bright black kids, from doing worse on tests than they would do precisely because it's high stakes. And what is it that suddenly makes them seem more stupid than they are? And he's an interesting and African-American scholar. So we decided to imagine if this guy was right, in what other ways might this show up? And we sort of purposely planned to observe certain things. And it was intriguing. It opened up whole avenues of noticing that helped us to see whether we were heading in the right direction. That's the kind of feedback that good professionalism requires. So you're listening to the theories of the scholars, but then you're also trying to see how that connects with the work you're doing.
We're being asked in the chat if you would repeat the name of that writer.
The last one?
Correct.
Mike Rose or the other?
I think it was Mike Rose.
Claude Steele. Steele. The University of, I think he's at Stanford. And he called this something like identity threat, some word like that.
Deborah, we started a little bit late, and I need to get a sense from you as to what your timing is. Would you like to finish at the top of the hour? Do you want to go a little bit past?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's up to you. Since I came late, it's all right with me.
Would it be okay if we went until 10 minutes past the hour?
Okay.
That will give us a chance to go to Q&A. Can you tell me the relationship between trust and testing? What's that relationship and where have we gone wrong?
Well, the kind of testing we now do is based on our distrust. The only reason we do it is because we don't trust. Otherwise, we don't trust the teachers. So we want some what we call objective measure, and we don't trust the kids. And so we try to figure out some objective way in which we can codify what the school has taught them. And once we want to make it objective and standardized, because we don't trust, we go from one step to the other of getting further and further away from really being able to assess what that child is up to. So we invent tests for reading that don't test reading. They don't even test simple-minded reading. And that's probably what Claude Steele was saying. Students are answering. There's two parts to that. One, the students are shut down by certain kinds of fear that they're going to look stupid. And the second of all is that the experiences that lead them to check A, B, C, or D are very different than what the test maker may assume. So their understanding of the question may differ, and there's no place. My son, when he was in third grade, told me he wrote little notes next to his answers because he thought to himself, well, B is probably what they want me to say, but I think C is right. So then he would write a little note. And I had a hard time convincing him that the computer didn't read the notes, and that if he thought they wanted him to answer B, he should answer B. But it's an assumption that makes it harder and harder for the student to trust us or us to understand the student. And then we begin to then the higher the stakes are for us or the student, the more we feel we have to teach to the test. So then our relationship is built all around the testing. And so the purpose of this schooling was to make sure that kids get the answer to those questions. Not that they have reasoned their way to questions in a way that shows us that they know how to think about that subject. The way my son, his little note said, maybe you think it should be B, but this is my thinking. He said it in a third grade way, but that's what I want to know. It's that second question. Why did you answer that way? What were you thinking? And I've done that with kids, and it just startles me that once they start trusting me enough to tell me what they're thinking, that it's just their answers were sometimes brilliant. But and they sometimes were just sheer guesses. Well, I knew it wasn't this. And I'd say, how do you know it wasn't that? And it really was that, but they were interpreting that differently. So, I could go on with the subject for a long time. I'm just also reading all kinds of marvelous stuff published in the 1970s about the fallibility of testing, but it has been always an American, particularly American phenomena. And there's a wonderful, as well as Asian, by the way, although their exams are somewhat different. But there's a wonderful new book out by someone named Young Xiao, Yongzhao, called Catching Up or Leading the Way, in which he argues that it is precisely the ancient and continuous Chinese emphasis on examinations that is handicapping China's education system, and that they are recognizing this handicap but don't know how to get out of that. And he said it's funny for him to come to America and see us undermining our own strengths and trying to copy the worst features of Chinese education.
So we have had Yang Zhao on the show. For those of you who are listening, there is a recording of the interview on that very book. And again,
I summed him up.
You've done a great job of setting him up. Yes, you did a good job. So you talk about, and I want to move to Q&A, and so it's just a couple more questions from me. You talk about the conditions that foster good teaching, and you talk a lot about small schools and choice and autonomy, and you make a really compelling case for this way of thinking about education. In the era of waiting for Superman, what kind of advice do you give to people who want to make a difference but feel as though they're facing this sort of large-scale, federally mandated education reform movement?
Well, let me just say one thing about the way you've posed it. The fact of the matter is, there are always trade-offs. And so you have to first decide, why are we doing this, before you can decide which should I trade off. Now, I like choice and small schools, but I would trade them off if I don't think they're not the magic bullet. It's easier to trust people whom you know and whom you can all sit around one table. But if the purpose of sitting around the table is to take orders, then the smallness is irrelevant. So what would I tell people? I would tell them, listen, if you're going in, the only way you should go into any profession is if you think you can really use yourself and your mind and your heart well in this field. So there's no point in your compromising in ways that make you hate yourself. So you have to figure that out. And one way to figure that out is to make sure that you go into a school that you have some shot at being able to survive that. And you need to walk around the school and think, is this a place you can just even imagine that you won't break down to tears just walking down the hall? And then you want to go someplace where you see there are at least a few other teachers whom you can meet with after school, and you can meet with sometimes in the evening, and whom you can debrief with. And if you don't have them in the school, you need to find some teachers in other schools whom you can trust to talk about your experiences. And you should, if possible, write about your experiences so that you can try to think it through, which is part of the purpose of these meeting with other people. And then always keep imagining that there's always cracks, even in any system. And there are ways to enlarge those cracks so that kids get more of an opportunity to be heard, listened to, respected. And that there are ways to do that with families. It may have been set up so you don't have the time, but there may be ways in which you can carve out time. Invite parents in to join you. There's a good book by Lynn Streib, S-T-R-E-I-B. I don't remember the name. It just recently came out, and if you look under Lynn Streib, you'll find it, in which she talks about inviting parents, how she worked in schools that were not ideal and got parents into her classroom and herself into their homes. So there are, if you're alert to it and if you listen carefully, there are possibilities in any situation. But it may take more out of you than you're willing to give. But when you realize that that's happening, then you are in the wrong field. And that's what worries me. I'm afraid that too many of the people who I can inspire to start teaching are going to leave in 3 years because they got inspired under false pretenses.
Has there been any degree to which the Internet has provided for teachers to support each other that you feel is unique or new?
No, and I'm surprised. I don't know. And maybe the next culture of adults will, are more accustomed to this. Because I tried to do that at our school, get all of us to get on the Internet and write each other and so forth. And I didn't succeed. But that was 10 years ago. And maybe there are ways. I don't know. That's an interesting question. And it always seems to me it ought to be. The same way that I always thought if you could watch videotapes with a trusted friend, that you could learn things, but it didn't catch on the way I hoped it would. So I think I think it's hard, but maybe.
I think I'm hopeful that part of what we do in this interview does reflect the use of technology, this series, to bring people together. And I certainly feel as though some of the regulars who come to the show feel like a community. And I think there is inherent in some of these new technologies maybe more of an ability to do that. We're going to move to Q&A. We've got about 14 minutes. And if you have a question, I've taken note of a couple here, and I'll start feeding them to Deborah. But you can put your question in the chat, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand. And that's the hand with the green up arrow, and we'll let you take the microphone and you can ask it in person. Deborah, Kenny asks, do you think teacher education programs have a role to play in helping educators trust one another, their students, and their students' families?
I think they could. There was a very good experiment at the University of Michigan, I believe that's where it was, in which they tried to create schools of education for professional development that are more like the communities I'm talking about in schools, where the faculty, a small group of faculty and a small group of students, take on a common project, adopt a school, so to speak, and that they work at it together so that they experience, while they're still pre-professionals, what a professional learning community is about. Because I think, if we've been taught all our lives in one kind of school and we want people to do something differently, I think we have to think of all the opportunities we can for modeling a different kind of community. And I think there are very few schools of education that do a good job of that.
So if you have a question for Deborah, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand with the green up arrow. Deb B asks, who are you watching now in education?
Well, I'm watching all my old schools, and every time I go speak somewhere around the country, I go to look at some schools that people tell me are good, because I'm kind of curious what they mean. So I'm trying to figure out, that's my project, to figure out what the language is and where I can connect. But, for example, there's the KIPP schools, which are in many ways ideologically the opposite of what I'm proposing. But I have run into some people I really like who are KIPP teachers, in one case a principal. And I'm trying to see whether over time those KIPP people who stick with it close to children, I'm not talking about the people who become policymakers, but the people close to the kids, whether as they get to know more, their ideas begin to change. Whether there's going to be a new reform movement such as I believe in that comes up out of other sources, that doesn't spring out of the previous progressive movement, but comes out of other sources. And I think a lot of the people who go into Teach for America, for example, have no background in the kind of education that they are being placed into, so that they're enormously dependent then on what they're told these kinds of kids need. And so they do what they're told, and most of them only last 2 or 3 years. That's all they've promised. So they don't get to the point where they begin to say, well, maybe that was not true. I was told when I went into those schools, something that these children have no language. And all these children have no families. And it was only because I had been very active in the civil rights movement before that I was suspicious of that claim. But it's understandable. But if these people stay, if these young Teach for America stay in schools, they may build their own form of the tradition that I'm describing.
So for those of you who are interested, we did have an interview with, I'm forgetting his name, the guy who wrote the book for Teach for America, but Teaching as Leadership. I was really taken, Deborah, by your garden analogy. And, I think about KIPP as that's not necessarily the garden that I would grow. And it's different choice of plants and a different kind of way of structuring the garden. But part of what I think you're saying is that we need to allow for there to be those differences.
Yeah, but I think we also need to be able to feel free to criticize them. The part about KIPP that worries me most is their assumptions about the children, their distrust of the kids and the kids' families. And that's really what it's not so much this technique or that technique, but what I see as disrespect. And but on the other hand, I suspect that if I visited enough KIPP schools, I would begin to see the differences. That as people carry out this model, how they begin to infuse it with their own respect for parents and children in ways that that transform KIPP itself. I'm hoping that because if this notion that is so central to me of respectful, trusting relationships as essential to the idea of community and essential there for democracy, then that's the common thread I'm looking for and thinking about, whether people wear uniforms or don't. It's not a question of respect. Whether people say sir or not. There are all kinds of artificial things that I don't think are at the heart of respect, but they sometimes stand as symbols for it, and that can confuse us.
Have you seen communities in which interested parents or teachers or administrators somehow were able to create an environment for a larger civil dialogue around education that maybe didn't come from the schools but made an impact or an influence in a positive way?
This is your question. Well, I'm trying to think whether that question over. There are periods, particular moments in any school and community where people are sometimes very passionate. And during such periods, there's also frequently a lot of antagonism and anger. And I'm intrigued by the cases in which that anger was turned into dialogue. The teachers' strike in 1968, there was an enormous amount of anger about it in New York between whites and blacks and between teachers and parents. But there are schools that had the first honest dialogues that came out of that. And I think probably it's something to do with the fact that before the crisis, there had been some decent relationships built, and that people sort of took a second look at one moment and said, I'm treating this person like they're a devil, and I know she's not a devil because that's why she took my child home. You know what I mean? There's some common experiences that force us to step back for a moment and say, let's listen to each other.
So Julia asks, what do you think of schools like Big Picture Learning?
I love Big Picture Learning. I don't think I could ever do it because I'm much more of an academic than Dennis Lipke, who I think it's a breakthrough in thinking about schools. It forces you, that model forces us to really rethink what it's all about and why do kids need certain things and what underlies that need. And when I have visited those schools, I'm just floored. I mean, the attendance is so extraordinary. And the respectfulness is so obvious, and the investment between kids and the network of kids and the adults who sort of shepherding them through for 4 years. And I think they've had success with kids they've had success with, obviously, with some extremely brilliant, self-motivated kids who are blossom. But they've also had success with kids I think we may not have been so successful with at Central Park East. Because it was still too much of a school. And I don't know, I think it's a brilliant departure. that is really challenging us all. And therefore, when you said, what should we keep our eye on? Keep your eye on Dennis Lipke.
So there were several times in fact, Dennis is committed to coming on the show, but we haven't been able to figure out a time yet. There were several times in the chat when people asked about what gave you an ability to speak up. And Ed just posted that you were awarded a MacArthur grant and that you had felt that that gave you some voice, but that anybody can have voice. Is that accurate? And I will say that anybody can have voice, but you've done a particularly good job of it.
Well, first of all, I came in teaching. I think it's related to the fact that I came in teaching in my 30s. And I came in after having a sort of political life in the civil rights movement. And having gone to a progressive school where I thought, as I think so many of the graduates of our schools do, that I had a right to, not only right, I had an obligation to make my voice heard when I thought I had a contribution to make. And so I had a lot of experience with it, and I had done a lot of writing. So as soon as I started teaching, I started writing about teaching. I had done writing on housing things and on civil rights issues in my neighborhood in Chicago.
You have one old message.
Ooh. And so I think those gave me I think it's much harder to feel that way when you're 22, but not necessarily so. And the second thing is, it's certainly true that after I got the MacArthur, I was listened to more respectfully. I don't know that I talked more, but people decided I must be an expert, a genius, whereas before they tended to think that I was a passionate do-gooder. So it shifted the balance a little about how, when I was asked to speak, what role I was expected to be, whether I was the sort of in the field color or whether I was an expert. And it's true that school people are in the world of, in many worlds that you and I belong to, are really not respected. So the MacArthur gave me respect.
So we have just a couple of minutes left. I wanted to let you finish, if you would, with a little bit about the importance of democracy and how it relates to schools. And especially, I think many of us are feeling that this is kind of a critical moment. I've been intrigued at the events even of the last week, where I felt like our inability to articulate democratic ideals is leading us down a path that we may not be comfortable with. Are you comfortable kind of closing on that thought?
Yes, I am, but it's much too big a subject to close with. I think we are, it's never been quite fully a democracy. We've always been a democracy in progress. It's a project. But I think that you're right, that we are on the other side of a line that I think is very frightening, and I don't see what's there to block it. The decline of the labor movement, the absence of any other institutions of the people make it hard for me to see how the special moneyed interests can be stopped. And they're perfectly, we assume that people who go into a business for money want to make money. But I don't know what stops them anymore. I don't know constitutionally or just organizationally what we used to have were sort of other interest groups that were organized for other purposes, and I don't think we have much of that anymore. So I think it is scary, and I don't think we've ever articulated democracy very well, and certainly we haven't given it respectability inside schools. I mean, if even teachers don't have a vote on anything to do with the way the school runs, why should they have a vote on nuclear policy? I mean, there's something illogical about our. If you were coming down from Mars, I don't think you would look at our school system. I don't think you would imagine that democracy is high on our agenda. And I think everything, the thing that sustained it was when you have people organized, because every individual, democracy isn't very important. My vote probably is not going to count. I mean, one vote. I remember my mother did once lose a primary by one vote, and my father. But generally speaking, one vote doesn't. It's the fact that we can be a people, a group of people who, in association with each other, can make our voices heard. But it's very hard to shape the agenda when people with billions of dollars. Think about that movie, Waiting for who was it? Waiting for Batman, I like to say. A billionaire Batman, not the nice civil servant Clark Kent. But that billions. I mean, money was spent on that film as though this like a Hollywood film. Whereas most of us, there's some wonderful documentaries that friends of mine have put out about schools, but if we raise $25,000, we think that's incredible, and it shows just to our friends. It's very hard. It's very scary, but that means that we've got a window of opportunity, and I think we've just got to figure out all the creative ways to make a fuss and to bring attention to the possibility that the people should be heard.
Deborah, you can't see, but I'm clapping for you. We are so appreciative of your coming on. If you want more really interesting discussion, 2 nights from now, Thursday night, Alfie Kohn will be on. It should make for a very fun week.
Oh, good.
Again, tomorrow night is the EduBlog Awards. If you are interested, Future of Education was nominated. Could use your vote, edublogawards.com, and the live ceremony
what
tomorrow
was the
night.
name?
Oh, it's edublogawards.com. You don't need to worry about it, Deborah, but our audience will know that I'm co-hosting that award show, and it is tomorrow night. It's a little bit early. It's at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And then, again, a little bit of a break until the new year where you can see the fun list of guests coming up. Deborah, thanks again so much for your work and for spending the time tonight.
Keep me connected, and thank you all.
Thank you so much. You're getting clapped for. Jackie's asking what time is Alfie Kohn? Same time, same bat channel, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Lots of clapping. Deborah, again, thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll let you go as we know it's late for you now.
And Alfie, my love.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for reminding me. Alfie Kohn is not the same time. It is 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. Boy, I almost steered you wrong there. Okay, that was really terrific. So delightful to have Deborah on, and highly recommend her books. And in fact, in her book, The Power of Their Ideas, there's a great suggested readings section, and that's now going to be my new reading list. More information in her books, The Power of Their Ideas and Schools We Trust, and her newest one, Playing for Keeps. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Illuminate and Learn Central for supporting the interview series. Sure appreciate your being a part of it. Have a good night, everybody. Yes, good luck to anybody involved or nominated in the EduBlog Awards. And do note that as a co-host, I'm allowed to say this, it is an imperfect system. So please come and celebrate even if you haven't been nominated, because everybody participates in unique ways, and we'll have a lot of fun. The books, again, are The Power of Their Ideas. In fact, if you go to my blog post, it shows all of Deborah's books. The Power of Their Ideas, In Schools We Trust, and Playing for Keeps. Thanks, everybody. Good night.